High above Germany, in air so thin that breath turns to frost and metal groans under the cold, the Luftwaffe still believed they owned the sky. Every day, veteran German pilots dove through bomber formations like steel blades, turning American B-17 flying fortresses into slow-falling embers drifting down through the clouds. They were confident, they laughed, and they believed that no single-engine fighter on Earth could escort American bombers into the heart of the Reich. But 3 months later, on a steel-gray morning in March 1944, the sky over Berlin revealed a shape no one in Nazi Germany thought could ever exist. P-51 Mustangs, sleek silhouettes with long wings and the hard growl of Merlin engines, were flying in perfect step with more than 600 American heavy bombers. They were not turning back. They were not running low on fuel. They had crossed the threshold of the impossible. That moment did more than shift the balance of air power. It marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's collapse, the end of its ability to choose when to fight, and the end of its belief that Germany's skies would always be its sanctuary. From that day forward, German pilots were no longer hunters. They were prey. At 25,000 feet, war becomes something different. The air is thin. The cold cuts through flight suits and freezes oxygen masks. Engines howl against the wind, metal groans under pressure, and every breath tastes like steel. Inside this hostile sky, German and American pilots entered a world that human beings were never meant to survive. A world of sudden violence, disappearing aircraft, burning oxygen lines, and choices made in seconds that determined whether a man would live or simply vanish. By early 1944, the air war above Germany had become a place stripped of mercy, stripped of glory, stripped of meaning. It was survival in its purest form, and no one felt this more than the Luftwaffe. In 1943, the Luftwaffe still had a core of elite pilots, aces forged in Poland, France, Britain, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. But by February and March of 1944, something irreversible was happening. The veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. Men with 300, 400, 800 missions. Men who knew every weakness of a bomber formation. Men who could sense an ambush before radar could see it. Men who were the backbone of Germany's air defense. By the time Mustangs reached Berlin, many of these men were gone. Their replacements were barely out of flight school. Boys who had never practiced gunnery under real pressure. Boys who had never flown above 20,000 feet. Boys who entered combat with trembling hands and only a handful of hours in type. And when they climbed toward the bomber streams, they found something waiting for them. Something faster, higher, colder, and utterly relentless. The cockpit of a Bf-109 was cramped, barely enough room to move shoulders, and visibility was poor, especially over the nose. When Mustangs appeared above them, many German pilots never even saw the attack coming. Adolf Galland described it. In 1943, we hunted. In 1944, we were hunted. The change was immediate. The Mustangs always came from above. The FW-190, once a feared predator, now struggled as well. At high altitude, its performance suffered drastically. Climb rate slowed. Roll response dulled. Engines coughed in the thin air. Meanwhile, the Mustangs, thanks to their Merlin engines and laminar flow wings, thrived where German aircraft suffocated. The battlefield had moved to the one place the Luftwaffe could no longer fight effectively. Early 1944 saw a shift that German pilots could feel with every raid. The sky was filling with American fighters. Not dozens, not scores, hundreds. The 8th Air Force now fielded entire wings of P-51s, 4th Fighter Group, 354th Pioneer Mustang Group, 357th, 352nd, 339th, 361st. Each group trained aggressively, each pilot confident, each fighter operating at altitudes and ranges German pilots had believed impossible. For a Luftwaffe pilot taking off from a field outside Hanover or Münster, the dread was immediate. Where are they? They are already here. The psychological weight of constant inferiority crushed the will to fight long before fuel tanks ran dry. The American bomber formation, the so-called combat box, looked orderly on paper. In reality, it was chaos. Gunners fired into the sky at shadows, heat mirages and glints of sunlight reflecting off distant canopies. Smoke twisted between engines. Wing turbulence shook aircraft violently. Shrapnel from friendly fire cut into neighboring planes. Inside a B-17, the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Hands froze to metal handles. Wind tore through bullet holes. Far below, fields of Germany turned slowly, like a map men would never walk on again. For German pilots charging head-on at the formation, the experience was nightmarish. Blinding muzzle flashes, walls of .50 caliber fire, explosions from self-defense grenades, burning debris raining downward, the sound of shells tearing through aluminum at 400 miles per hour. Veteran pilot Heinz Knoke described it. You enter a storm of steel. The world becomes noise and fire, and once you commit to the attack, there is no turning back. When Mustangs joined the fight, the nightmare intensified. The Luftwaffe had perfected their tactics through years of experience, massed frontal attacks. Diving slashes from altitude, decoy maneuvers to draw escorts away, hit-and-run approaches to conserve energy, quick landings to refuel for another strike. But 1944 changed everything. Frontal attacks failed. Mustangs attacked before Germans even reached the formation. Diving attacks failed. Mustangs followed, matching the dive and continuing into German airspace. Hit and run failed. The run part no longer existed. Quick landings became suicide. Mustangs waited over runways like hawks circling over exhausted prey. What had once been science became guesswork. What had once been domination became desperation. American pilots were told to destroy the Luftwaffe at any cost. And they did. They targeted fighters assembling for takeoff, aircraft taxiing on runways, student pilots practicing patterns, fuel trucks, supply depots, radar stations, maintenance hangars. Mustang pilots called it freelancing. To German pilots, it was something else. It was the end. A Luftwaffe instructor wrote, "We trained boys to fly 5 hours and then sent them into a sky filled with Mustangs. It was not war. It was slaughter." Despite the strategic analysis, the statistics, and the engineering marvels, the air war was ultimately paid for in human suffering. Pilots burned alive inside cockpits. Parachutes failed to open in the cold. Gunners bled out beside their guns, unwilling to let go. Bodies fell for miles through clouds before disappearing into forests and fields. One Mustang pilot, Lieutenant William Wisner, described watching a German pilot bail out while burning. He was hitting his own flight suit, trying to beat out the flames as he fell. There was nothing anyone could do. The hell within was not in the machines. It was in the men dash. Their fear, their endurance, their silence. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the proud force that had terrified Europe in 1940. The signs were everywhere. Letters home filled with resignation. Pilots avoiding eye contact before missions. Veteran aces writing farewell notes. Teenagers trembling as they strapped into fighters. Squadrons losing half their strength in a single week. Airfields bombed beyond recognition. One young pilot wrote in April 1944, "We take off knowing most of us will not return." The Americans are everywhere. It was more than defeat. It was the slow erosion of hope. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots reached a moment none of them wanted to face. They no longer believed they could win. They flew because orders demanded it. They fought because they had no choice. They died because the alternative was surrender. The hell within was not the cold, or the flames, or the bullets, or the fear. It was understanding that the sky, once their home, once their kingdom, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Mustang. Spring 1945, across the airfields of the collapsing Reich, Berlin, Munich, Prague, Hamburg, wrecked FW-19s and BF-19s lay scattered like the bones of a vanished era. Some burned on shattered runways. Some rested half-buried in muddy fields. Some simply sat abandoned, fuel tanks empty, engines silent, as if frozen mid-breath. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, had become only a shadow of what it used to be. The veterans were gone, Men who had fought through Poland, France, Britain, Africa, and Russia. Their replacements were boys, 17 years old, barely trained, barely prepared, barely surviving their first minutes in combat. On the Allied side, P-51 Mustangs lined runways from England to France and Belgium, hundreds of them, ready every single morning. Their pilots were experienced, their fuel tanks full, their confidence unshaken. The war in the sky was no longer a contest, it was an ending. By 1945, the most decisive gap between the two air forces was not technology, nor tactics, nor numbers. It was time. A late-war German pilot averaged 40 to 50 hours of flight experience. An American Mustang pilot averaged 350 to 450 hours. Training, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, had become a formality. A ritual performed because the war demanded it, not because it worked. And the sky no longer gave them the time to learn. Every decision had minutes attached to it. Every maneuver had fuel limits attached to it. Every raid had a countdown attached to it. The Mustang had time. The Luftwaffe did not. When a force loses time, it loses the war before the battle even begins. Spring 1944. The oil campaign. Mustangs escorted bombers to Leuna, Pellets, Brooks, the factories that fed the Reich's engines. Oil production collapsed from 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 in July to 10,000 by September. Entire fighter wings sat idle for lack of fuel. The destruction of the rail network. Mustangs strafed locomotive lines day after day. German industry, built on the lifeline of rail transport, began to suffocate. Airfield denial. Mustangs circled German airfields, waiting for takeoffs and landings. A Bf-109 or FW-190, lowering its gear, became a target. Jet interception. Even the Me-262, the most advanced aircraft in the world, was powerless while landing on low throttle. Two worlds collided: high-tech German engineering and the brutal reality of endurance. The result was inevitable. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff wrote, "By late 1944, we were not fighting to win. We were fighting to take off. And many days, even that was impossible. The Luftwaffe had lost more than aircraft. It had lost the very concept of safe airspace. The sky, once the Germans' greatest advantage, was now occupied by an enemy that could fly anywhere. Anytime, with fuel to chase any survivor all the way home. A pilot in 1940 flew over Britain like a predator. A pilot in 1945 flew over Germany like a fugitive. The Luftwaffe's last pilots were teenagers. Some had fewer than 3 hours of flight time above 5,000 feet. Some had never fired their guns in real combat. Some had never solo landed in bad weather. Many had never seen a Mustang until the moment they were attacked. A letter from a young German pilot reads, "Today I will fly my first mission. They say no one has returned in 3 days. I hope to see my family again." 3 days of missions, dozens of young pilots. Almost none survived. To the Mustangs overhead, the battlefield was the sky. To these boys, the battlefield was a choice between obedience and death. By early 1945, the United States concluded, "The Luftwaffe is no longer an organized fighting force. It is a collection of survivors." The evidence was undeniable. Units existed only on paper. Aircraft were scattered and unfueled. Command structure had collapsed. Training had stopped entirely. Radar coverage was broken. Pilots refused missions that offered no hope of return. The Mustang, born from American industry and British engineering, had not simply defeated the Luftwaffe, it had broken it. In April 1945, German fighters sat abandoned on runways. Jet squadrons had fuel for one sortie per week. Airfields were craters. Maintenance crews had no parts. Pilots had no expectation of survival. Commanders had no illusions left. A Luftgau commando report concluded, "No unit can sustain combat operations for more than 24 hours. This was not a military force anymore. It was a terminal patient, waiting for its final breath. When the war finally ended, German pilots captured in Czechoslovakia, Bavaria, and Austria met Mustang pilots for the first time face to face. Some spoke with admiration, some spoke with bitterness, but most spoke with resignation. A veteran said, "The day we saw Mustangs over Berlin, we knew the war was lost." Another said, "It was not the bombers that destroyed the Luftwaffe, it was the Mustang." But the most haunting words came from a 19-year-old pilot. "I never fired at a Mustang. They always fired first." For that generation, the war was not a duel. It was an exam, for which they had never been taught the answers. In the end, the P-51 Mustang became more than a fighter aircraft. It was the symbol of Allied industrial power, the proof of American-British cooperation, the turning point of the air war, the weapon that erased the Luftwaffe's dominance, the reminder that in modern war, endurance decides everything. The Mustang did not just take the sky, it took the illusion of German invincibility. It ended the air war. And with it, the last hope of a Reich that once believed it could command the heavens. October 1943. Above the gray frozen skies of Germany, American bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory with a quiet, uneasy confidence. The B-17 Flying Fortress, engines trembling in the thin air, held formation against the wind as waist gunners scanned the empty horizon. They knew the pattern by heart. They would cross into Germany, the escort fighters would turn back, and then the real battle would begin. Because the Luftwaffe was waiting. At airfields scattered across central Germany, Kassel, Frankfurt, Schweinfurt, Gotha, German fighter groups prepared for another day of hunting. Their pilots knew the rhythm of this war better than anyone. Once the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings reached the edge of their fuel limits and turned for home, the bombers would be alone. And when the bombers were alone, they died. Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, proved it with brutal clarity. 60 B-17 fell in a single day. 17 more limped home, so damaged they were scrapped on landing. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. To American commanders, it was a disaster. To German pilots, it was confirmation. The mathematics of air war belonged to them. They believed they understood everything. The bomber formation's weaknesses, the timing of escort withdrawal, the limits of American range, and the predictable fear of gunners trapped inside aluminum coffins. And for a while, they were right, until something arrived that rewrote the equation. Air combat in Europe followed rules carved in steel and blood. A B-17 carried 13.50 caliber machine guns, but it only survived if the formation stayed intact. And the Luftwaffe had spent months perfecting the art of tearing bomber boxes open. Head-on attacks. German pilots like Heinz Knock dived straight into the formation from 12 o'clock high, firing 2-second bursts of 20mm cannon shells into the cockpit and engines before top turret gunners could respond. Company front charges, 8, 10, sometimes 12, FW-190S flying wing to wing, an entire wall of fighters crashing into the formation at nearly 600 miles per hour closing speed. American gunners could not pick a single target. They fired blind. The golden moment. The one moment German pilots cherished, the moment American escorts turned back. No P-47 could reach deep Germany. No P-38 could survive high-altitude winter without mechanical failures. No Spitfire had the range at all. And when the escorts left, the Luftwaffe struck with precision, the kind that comes from fighting over your own homeland, with radar guidance and short flight times back to base. Germany believed the sky was theirs by right. They had every reason to believe in their dominance. 1. They fought above their own territory. A damaged German pilot could land anywhere. A damaged American bomber fell into captivity or into the earth. 2. They had radar networks the Americans could not match. Every bomber stream was tracked miles before reaching landfall. 3. Their pilots were veterans. Men forged in Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Thousands of hours of combat experience. 4. The American combat box had exploitable cracks. One bomber shot down meant a hole meant chaos, and chaos meant German victory. 5. And most importantly, the Americans had no long-range fighter. Every deep raid into Germany was a gamble the Luftwaffe profited from day after day. They believed they controlled the pace of the air war. They believed they controlled the rules. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was laughing, confident, certain. They had no idea their world was about to collapse. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission asked North American Aviation for more P-40s. Instead, the company made a reckless promise. "We'll build you a new fighter from scratch. Give us 120 days. Somehow, impossibly, they did. The NA-73X, prototype of what would become the Mustang, flew within months. But the early Mustang, powered by the Allison engine, was mediocre above 15,000 feet, too weak for high-altitude combat, too limited for escort missions. No one saw its future, except one man. Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew the Mustang in April 1942 and wrote a memo that changed air war history. "This airframe is superior to anything we have. Only the engine is holding it back. Fit it with the Merlin 61 and you will have the best fighter in the world." The British listened, and the transformation began. In late 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustang took to the air. It did not just fly better, it redefined what a fighter could be. Speed jumped from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling climbed from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. High-altitude performance became exceptional, but the real miracle was fuel efficiency. Where a P-47 drank 100 gallons per hour, a Merlin Mustang consumed just 65 at similar speeds. With new 75-gallon drop tanks and later 108-gallon tanks, the Mustang's radius extended beyond 850 miles, enough to fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and return home. For the first time in the war, the United States had a fighter that could escort bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe did not know yet, but their fate was sealed. December 13, 1943, bomber raid to Kiel. For the first time, German pilots reported something strange. The escorts did not turn back. Radar operators requested confirmation. Fighter controllers dismissed the reports. Experienced pilots assumed misidentification. But the pattern repeated, again and again. The escorts were pushing deeper, too deep for any Allied fighter they knew of. The Luftwaffe still believed they understood the rules of air war. They did not know the rules were already broken. On the morning of March 4, 1944, at 25,000 feet, the sky over Berlin darkened with the shadows of more than 600 American heavy bombers. And around them, silent, disciplined, and impossibly far from home, flew dozens of P-51 B Mustangs. For the first time in history, American single-engine fighters had reached Berlin. German radar stations reported escorts still with the formation. Controllers dismissed the readings. Veteran pilots assumed an error. But when squadrons of JG-26 and JG-11 climbed to intercept, they saw it with their own eyes. Not P-47s, not P-38s, not Spitfires, Mustangs. A machine the Luftwaffe believed could not reach Berlin had arrived. And with that arrival, the power balance of the European air war began to collapse. Inside the Luftwaffe command network, confusion spread. Confirm escort type. Impossible. They cannot be P-51s. Check again. Escort still present. For years, German pilots were taught one certainty. The Americans had no fighter that could escort bombers into central Germany. That certainty shattered in a single morning. The Mustangs were not struggling. They were not turning back. They were leading the way, climbing above German interceptors, dictating the fight before it began. A weapon the Luftwaffe had not prepared for had entered their airspace, with fuel to spare. Luftwaffe training manuals in early 1944 still stated, P-51 fighters lack the range for deep penetration escort. They pose no threat over central Germany. German pilots believed they chose the moment of battle. They controlled altitude advantage. They controlled timing. They always had an escape window after attacking bombers. They could force Americans to fight on German terms. But now every assumption was wrong. The escorts weren't leaving. The timing wasn't theirs, and the altitude advantage wasn't theirs. And the escape window, once their greatest weapon, had vanished. The rules of air war had flipped in one day. For German pilots climbing toward the bomber stream, the shock came fast. When they moved to initiate a head-on pass, Mustangs dropped from above before they could reach firing position. When they tried to dive away, Mustangs followed. When they disengaged to conserve fuel, Mustangs closed the gap with ease. JG-26 Ace Klaus Medisch wrote, "They did not come to protect the bombers. They came to hunt us." Another pilot recorded, "I climbed to attack. They were already waiting above us. We were no longer in control. We were being led like prey." For the first time since 1939, Luftwaffe pilots felt something unfamiliar. They were not the hunters anymore. Mustangs had what German fighters lacked: time. A Bf-109 or FW-190 could fight for minutes before fuel became critical. Pilots were constantly calculating how far they could push before turning back. A P-51 could fight for hours. German pilots learned this the hard way. Dive, Mustang follows. Level flight, Mustang closes. Low altitude escape, Mustang still behind them. Racing home on fumes, Mustang waiting above the airfield. A Luftwaffe pilot wrote, "I could escape another fighter. I could not escape time, and the Mustang had all the time in the world." This was not a contest of skill. It was a contest of endurance, and Germany had already lost. At the start of 1944, General James Doolittle issued orders that rewrote Allied air strategy. Fighters will not stay locked to the bombers. Seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it can be found. The old defensive escort doctrine was dead. Mustangs were now free to roam, free to climb above formations, free to dive into German airspace, free to pursue retreating fighters, free to attack airfields, rail lines, and training units. Luftwaffe pilots, trained for predictable patterns of escort withdrawal, could not adapt. They were caught inside a war that no longer followed the rules they had mastered. It took only 3 weeks for their tactical advantage to collapse. March 4th, 1944 was more than a raid. It was the collision of two worlds. Germany's old doctrine: choose when to attack, hit from altitude advantage, break off before escorts respond, refuel and return, fight over home soil. America's new doctrine: control the sky, not just the bombers. Attack first, hunt always. Pursue until the enemy has nowhere left to run. Use endurance as a weapon. Deny the Luftwaffe every safe space. It was like a swordsman charging into a battlefield filled with rifles. Skill alone could not save the Luftwaffe now. German pilots reported something terrifying. The same Mustang would chase them for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes. Before 1944, this was impossible. No Allied fighter had the fuel. Hans Pfeiffer of JG-11 wrote, "I looked back, nothing. I looked again, Mustang. Then it followed every turn, every dive, every hope I had disappeared." This was the moment Luftwaffe morale began to break. They finally understood. They were no longer fighting pilots. They were fighting time itself. Before Mustangs, the route home was sacred, a place of relief, exhaustion, and survival. After Mustangs, it became the most dangerous part of the mission. Mustangs waited at low altitude, waited near radar beacons, waited near airfields, waited along the known retreat paths. They did not fight like escorts, they fought like predators. When a Bf-109 lowered its landing gear, it became a target. When a FW-190 extended flaps, it became prey. One American pilot put it bluntly, "It stopped being combat. It became execution." The Luftwaffe wasn't losing battles. It was losing the war hour by hour. Fuel tanks empty, runways cratered, veteran pilots dead, replacements poorly trained, command overwhelmed, radar stations destroyed. Meanwhile, American factories pushed out. 20 Mustangs a day from California, 15 more from Dallas. The Germans were not outmatched. They were drowned. The first Mustang escort to Berlin did not deliver the highest casualties. It did not create the largest dogfight, but it did something far more important. It proved the Luftwaffe had lost control of its own airspace. From that moment on, German airfields were targets. Training units were targets. Retreat paths were targets. The entire sky above Germany became a battlefield they could not escape. It was not just a turning point, it was the beginning of the end. The day the Mustangs flew over Berlin, the Luftwaffe learned a truth no pilot wants to face. The war was no longer theirs to win.